The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across Elena's face as she clutched the crumpled medical bill in her trembling hands. $200,000. The numbers blurred through her tears, but the reality remained crystal clear. Without the experimental treatment, her 12-year-old brother Marco would be dead within 6 months. Miss Vasquez. The nurse's voice cut through her spiral of despair. The business office is closing soon. We'll need a payment plan by tomorrow, or we'll have to transfer Marco to County General. Elena nodded mechanically, stuffing the bill into her worn purse. County General meant no experimental treatment. It meant watching Marco waste away in a sterile room while she pretended everything would be okay. The elevator descended with agonizing slowness, each floor marking another step toward impossible choices. She'd already sold everything of value, worked 3 jobs, and begged every bank in the city. There was nowhere left to turn. The parking garage smelled of oil and exhaust, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic hospital corridors. Elena fumbled for her keys, her vision blurring again when she spotted the familiar silver Bentley parked in the visitor section. Even in her devastation, she recognized the custom license plate. Sterling, Damien Sterling, her former boss. Man who'd fired her 6 months ago for refusing his advances. The universe apparently had a twisted sense of humor. Elena. His voice carried that same commanding tone that had once made her pulse quicken for all the wrong reasons. He stepped out of the shadows between 2 SUVs, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the late hour. I heard about Marco. I don't want your pity. She clutched her keys like weapons, ready to bolt. Good, because I'm not offering it. His gray eyes swept over her disheveled appearance, from her wrinkled scrubs to her tear-stained cheeks. I'm offering you a solution. Elena laughed bitterly. Let me guess. The same solution you offered when I worked for you? Hard pass, Mr. Sterling. Not that kind of solution. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something sharper. Desperation, maybe. I need a wife. The words hung in the stale garage air like a challenge. Elena stared at him, searching for the punchline. Damien Sterling, the 34-year-old tech mogul worth $3 billion, needed a wife like she needed another medical. Bill. My grandfather's will has a marriage clause, he continued, his voice steady but his hands betraying him with slight tremors. If I'm not married by my 35th birthday, the company goes to my cousin Richard. That's in 8 weeks. Marry one of your socialite girlfriends? They all want something permanent. Children, love. He spat the last word like poison. You want something I can actually give you? Money. Elena's phone buzzed. A text from Marco's nurse. Blood work came back. We need to start treatment soon. How are we doing with payment? The parking garage felt like it was closing in around her. She thought of Marco's too bright smile when she'd read him Harry Potter that morning. How he'd joked about being brave like Gryffindor, even though his lips were blue from lack of oxygen. How much money? She whispered. All of it. Every medical bill, every treatment, every experimental drug Marco needs. Plus enough to ensure he never wants for anything again. Damien pulled out his phone, showing her a bank transfer screen with more zeros than she'd ever seen.
Oh.
The marriage lasts exactly 8 weeks. We divorce the day after my birthday, you walk away wealthy, and Marco gets to grow up. The moral weight of it settled on her shoulders like lead. Marry a man she despised, to save the only family she had left. Pretend to love someone who'd made her skin crawl with his entitled pursuit. But Marco's face swam in her vision, his gap-toothed grin, his dreams of becoming a marine biologist, his trust that his big sister would find a way to fix everything. There are conditions, she said finally. Damien's mouth curved into something that might have been relief. Name them. We don't share a bed ever. This is business. Nothing more. Agreed. I want the money transferred to a trust for Marco before any ceremony. And I want legal documentation that you can't touch it, even if I don't fulfill my end. Smart girl. He stepped back, giving her space to breathe. Anything else? Elena looked up at the hospital windows, where somewhere on the 4th floor, her little brother was probably reading comic books and pretending he wasn't scared. I want to hate you for the next 8 weeks. Don't try to change that. For the first time since she'd known him, Damien Sterling looked almost human. I wouldn't dream of it. As Elena walked back toward the hospital entrance, the weight of her decision pressed against her chest like a physical force. She was about to marry the devil himself, but if it meant Marco would live to see his 13th birthday, she'd dance with demons for eternity. Behind her, she heard the Bentley's engine purr to life, but she didn't turn around. There would be plenty of time to regret this choice later. Right now, she had to tell a 12-year-old boy that his big sister had just sold her soul to save his life. The elevator doors closed, sealing her fate. The Sterling Industries boardroom felt like a cathedral of capitalism, all gleaming mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a godlike view of the city below. Elena sat across from Damien at the polished conference table, acutely aware that her target blouse looked laughably modest beside his Italian silk tie. Standard prenup, the lawyer explained, sliding documents across the table, though these circumstances are admittedly unusual. Lena scanned the contract, her journalism degree finally proving useful. The legal language was dense, but the terms were clear. 8 weeks of marriage, complete discretion, and enough money to transform Marcos' death sentence into a full life. The grandfather clause is here on page 7, Damien said, pointing to a highlighted section. If the marriage is discovered to be fraudulent, the inheritance reverts to Richard anyway. So we need to make this look real. Define real. Lena's pen hovered over the signature line. We live together. 10 social functions as a couple. Convince my family and the board that this isn't a business arrangement. His gray eyes met hers across the table. Can you manage that without looking like you want to murder me? I make no promises. The lawyer cleared his throat. There's also the matter of Mrs. Sterling's background check. The family will expect a complete history. Elena's blood chilled. Her background wasn't scandalous, just painfully ordinary. Night shifts at the diner, community college journalism classes. Okay. A tiny apartment that smelled like the neighbor's cooking. Everything that would scream gold digger to Damien's blue blood relatives. We'll create a cover story, Damien said smoothly. You're a freelance journalist working on a book about tech innovation? We met during an interview and fell for each other. It's believable enough. Is it? Elena challenged.
Yes.
You firing me? Kind of contradicts the love story narrative. I never fired you. The room went silent except for the lawyer's uncomfortable shifting. Elena stared at Damien, remembering that humiliating day 6 months ago when she'd refused his dinner invitation, and found herself escorted from the building by security. You had me blacklisted from every publication in the city, she said quietly. I had you transferred to freelance status with a generous severance package. What you did with those opportunities was your choice. The lie came so smoothly that Elena almost believed it herself. She'd spent months wondering why no editor would return her calls, why assignments dried up overnight. Now she knew. You destroyed my career because I wouldn't sleep with you. I protected my company from a sexual harassment lawsuit. His voice carried no remorse, only cold calculation. Your choice of words during our last conversation was quite memorable. Heat flooded Elena's cheeks as she remembered calling him an entitled bastard who thought women were prizes to be collected. She'd meant every word, but she'd also needed that job. Sign the contract, Elena. Marco's surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Reminder hit like ice water. While she'd been wrestling with her pride, her little brother was upstairs getting prepped for a procedure that would either save his life or bankrupt her trying. She signed her name with sharp, angry strokes. Excellent. Damien's satisfaction was practically tangible. The wedding is Friday, something small and tasteful at the Sterling family estate. This Friday, that's 4 days away. The sooner we're married, the sooner this is over. He stood, straightening his already perfect tie. My assistant will coordinate everything. Dress, flowers, guest list. I don't get a say in my own wedding. You get $200,000 in your brother's life. I'd say that's fair compensation for 1 day of playing dress-up. Lena watched him gather his papers with efficient, practiced movements. Every gesture screamed of wealth and privilege, of a man who'd never had to choose between groceries and electricity. There's one more thing, she said as he reached the door. He paused, his hand on the brushed steel handle. When this is over, when you have your inheritance and I have Marco's medical bills paid, I never want to see you again. Not at industry parties, not at charity galas, nowhere. Can your lawyers put that in writing? Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify. Consider it done. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Elena alone in the intimidating boardroom. Through the windows, the city sprawled below like a glittering circuit, bored, beautiful, and heartless. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marco. Nurse says surgery is tomorrow. You scared? She typed back. Never. You're going to be fine. I'll promise. Elena stared at the simple word until her vision blurred. Promises were dangerous things, especially when you'd just sold your integrity to keep them. Promise, she replied. The elevator ride down felt like descending into hell, except hell probably had better benefits and fewer morally compromising contracts. Elena clutched the signed papers against her chest, 47 floors of ethical free-fall stretching below. In 4 days, she would become Mrs. Damien Sterling. In 8 weeks, she would be free. She just had to survive the performance of a lifetime first. The elevator doors opened onto the bustling lobby, where normal people went about their normal lives without having to marry their worst enemies to save the people they loved. Lena envied them their uncomplicated choices as she stepped into the crowd. Another anonymous face, carrying secrets that could destroy everything she'd just agreed to protect. The Sterling family estate rose from manicured lawns, like something out of a Gothic novel. All stone columns and ivy-covered walls that whispered of old money and older secrets. Lena stood at the threshold in a dress that cost more than her monthly rent, feeling like an imposter in designer silk. Breathe, Damien murmured beside her, his hand warm against the small of her back. To any observer, the gesture would seem tender. Lena knew better. I'm fine. You're hyperventilating.
Hey.
The corseted bodice of the wedding dress made normal breathing impossible, but that wasn't what was stealing her air. It was the weight of 50 pairs of eyes evaluating her, judging whether she was worthy of the Sterling name. Remember the story? Damien whispered as they approached his grandmother, the formidable Margaret Sterling. We met during the tech innovation interview. We were fascinated by the humanitarian applications of AI. I was charmed by your passion. Charmed, right? Elena forced her mouth into something resembling a smile. Margaret Sterling looked like she'd been carved from marble by someone with strong opinions about proper posture. Her pearl necklace probably cost more than Elena's college tuition, and her pale blue eyes missed nothing. So you're the mysterious journalist who captured my grandson's heart. Margaret's voice carried decades of social authority. How refreshing to meet someone from outside our usual circles. It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Sterling. Elena had practiced this conversation in the mirror for 3 days, but the words still felt foreign on her tongue.
Tell me about your
book project. Damien mentioned you're writing about technology's role in social justice. Elena's mind went blank. They'd prepared for family questions, business questions, even deeply personal questions about their relationship. But nobody had briefed her on fake book plots. It's still in the early stages, she managed, grateful when Damien's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her waist. I'm exploring how AI can bridge economic divides rather than widen them. Fascinating. And how did you find Damien's insights? Enlightening. Elena met the older woman's gaze steadily. He has a unique perspective on technology as a tool for empowerment rather than exploitation. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. Even Elena could hear how the words painted Damien as something nobler than he was. But apparently it was the right answer, because Margaret's austere expression softened into something approaching approval. Indeed, I've always believed Damien needed someone who could see beyond the surface. She patted Elena's arm with surprising warmth. Welcome to the family. Dear, the ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows that tasted like ash and rings that felt like shackles. Elena smiled at the appropriate moments, laughed at the right jokes, and somehow managed to look like a woman in love instead of someone attending her own execution. The kiss was the worst part. Damien's lips were softer than she'd expected. His touch surprisingly gentle for a man she knew to be ruthless. For one terrifying moment, she almost forgot it was all pretense. There he murmured against her mouth, quiet enough that only she could hear. Not so terrible, was it? Back, her cheeks burning. The reception was held in the estate's grand ballroom, where crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across marble floors that had probably witnessed a century of Sterling celebrations. Elena nursed a glass of champagne that cost more than most people's weekly groceries and tried to look like she belonged. "You're doing well," said a voice behind her. Elena turned to find Richard Sterling, Damien's cousin, and the man who would inherit everything if this charade failed. He was younger than Damien, with the kind of easy charm that probably made him popular at country clubs and charity auctions. "You, though I feel a bit like I'm in a fairy tale, the kind with happy endings, or the kind where people get eaten by wolves." Richard's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I suppose that remains to be seen. Indeed. He sipped his whiskey, studying her with eyes that were calculating rather than friendly. "You know, I've been trying to place you. Elena Vasquez. The name sounds familiar." Elena's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression neutral. "I've written for several publications. Perhaps you've seen my byline. Perhaps, or maybe it was something else entirely." His smile widened, showing too many teeth. "I have an excellent memory for faces." Before Elena could respond, Damien appeared at her side with the predatory grace of a man who'd sensed a threat to his territory. "Richard, I see you've met my wife. Just getting acquainted." Elena was telling me about her journalism career. Richard's emphasis on the word career made it sound like something distasteful. Fascinating how paths cross in this city, isn't it? Damien's arm slipped around Elena's waist, a gesture that looked possessive rather than romantic. "If you'll excuse us, I'd like to dance with my bride." The ballroom floor was crowded with swaying couples, but Damien guided Elena to a relatively private corner where their conversation couldn't be overheard. His hand settled on her waist with practiced ease, as if they'd danced together hundreds of times. "What did Richard say to you?" "He thinks he recognizes me from somewhere." Elena tried to focus on the steps, rather than the warmth of Damien's palm against her back. "Do you think he knows about my real background?" "Richard knows everyone's real background. It's his specialty." Damien spun her gently, bringing her closer when she returned to his arms. "The question is whether he has proof of anything that could damage us." "Us." Elena looked up at him, struck by the plural pronoun. "There's no us. There's just a contract with an expiration date." Something flickered in Damien's gray eyes, gone too quickly to analyze. Of course, poor choice of words. The music swelled around them, a classical piece Elena didn't recognize, but that probably cost a small fortune to have performed live. Other couples swirled past in designer gowns and tailored suits, living the kind of effortless wealth that Elena had only read about in magazines. "How long do we have to stay?" she asked quietly. "Until it would be rude to leave. Another hour, maybe 2. And then we go home to the penthouse and begin the real performance. Living together, sleeping in the same space, convincing anyone who might be watching that we're genuinely married." The penthouse Elena had been so focused on surviving the wedding that she'd barely considered the living arrangements. Sharing space with Damien Sterling for 8 weeks, pretending to be happy about it. "Separate bedrooms," she said firmly. "Naturally. Though we'll need to be careful about appearances. My building has security cameras, housekeeping staff, neighbors who gossip." His thumb traced a small circle on her back, probably unconsciously. "We need to look like newlyweds, Elena, besotted with each other. I don't know if I'm that good an actress. You've been flawless so far?" The compliment caught her off guard, mainly because it sounded sincere. Elena studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or mockery, but found only something that might have been genuine admiration. "Don't look at me like that," she whispered. "Like what? Like you actually mean it?" The music ended, but Damien didn't release her immediately. They stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by applauding guests, trapped in a moment that felt dangerously real. "Maybe I do," he said finally, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. Then the spell broke. He stepped back, his professional mask sliding into place. And Elena remembered that Damien Sterling was exactly the kind of man who could make lies sound like poetry, When it served his purposes, the rest of the reception passed without incident. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted during that dance. Whether it was her perception of Damien or his perception of her, she wasn't sure. What she did know was that playing the role of his loving wife was about to become much more complicated than she'd bargained for. 3 weeks into their marriage, Elena discovered that Damien Sterling talked in his sleep. She'd been lying awake in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to the city's never-ending symphony 40 stories below, when his voice drifted through the walls. At first she'd thought he was on a late-night business call, but the broken cadence and desperate tone suggested something else entirely. "Please don't leave me alone with him." Elena sat up in bed, her pulse quickening. Somehow, stripped of its usual commanding authority, "I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." She padded barefoot across the cold marble floors to the door, separating their bedrooms. Through the thin gap beneath, she could see the flicker of his bedside lamp, still on at 2 a.m. "Mom, please come back." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 weeks sleeping 20 feet away from a man she thought she knew, only to discover that his subconscious held secrets that reframed everything. The next morning, Damien appeared in the kitchen, as usual, impeccably dressed and armored in professional composure. He poured coffee from the machine Elena had never learned to operate, his movements precise and efficient. "Sleep well?" he asked. Without looking at her, Elena studied his profile, searching for traces of the vulnerability she'd heard in the darkness. "Did you?" "Fine, thank you." The lie came so smoothly that she almost believed he wasn't aware of his midnight confessions. "Almost, Damien." She set down her orange juice with deliberate care. "Can I ask you something personal?" His shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Depends how personal. What happened to your mother?" The coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. When he finally met her eyes, Elena saw something raw and unguarded flicker across his face before the shutters slammed down. "That's not part of our agreement. Neither is pretending to care about each other, but we're managing that just fine. Leave it alone, Elena." But she couldn't. Maybe it was the journalist in her, or maybe it was the way his nightmares had sounded so much like Marco's after their parents died. Either way, she found herself researching Margaret Sterling's family history during her afternoon hospital visits. The internet was surprisingly forthcoming about the Sterling family tragedy. Damien's mother, Catherine, had died in a car accident when he was 8 years old. What the articles didn't mention was the custody battle that followed, or the way his father had used Damien as a weapon against his own mother. Elena was still processing what she'd learned when Damien came home that evening, his tie loosened, and his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with business meetings. "Long day?" she asked from the kitchen island where she'd been pretending to read. "Richard's getting suspicious. He's been asking questions about our relationship timeline, cross-referencing dates with your employment records." Damien poured himself 3 fingers of scotch, which was at least 2 more than usual. "I think he knows this is fake." "Can he prove it?" "Not yet, but Richard's patient. He'll wait until he has irrefutable evidence before making his move." Elena watched him drink, noting the slight tremor in his hands that suggested the day had been worse than long. "What happens if he exposes us?" "I lose everything. Company, the inheritance, my grandfather's respect." He laughed bitterly. "Though I suppose losing Richard's threats would be a relief." "What kind of threats?" Damien's laugh died abruptly. He studied Elena's face as if trying to determine whether she was genuinely concerned or just making conversation. "Matter. It matters to me." The word surprised them both. Elena hadn't meant to sound so sincere, but something about Damien's obvious exhaustion had triggered her protective instincts. The same ones that made her work 3 jobs to keep Marco in decent schools and fight insurance companies for his medical coverage. "Why?" Damien asked quietly. "Because despite everything, I don't want to see you destroyed by a man like Richard." She moved closer, noting how he didn't retreat this time. "And because I heard you last night, talking in your sleep." The color drained from his face. "What did you hear? Enough to know that your childhood wasn't the privileged fairy tale?" "I assumed it was." Damien set down his glass with shaking hands. For a moment, Elena thought he might actually open up to her. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out at the city lights, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. My father was an alcoholic, he said finally. After my mother died, he alternated between complete neglect and explosive rage. I learned very early that survival meant being perfect, being useful, being whatever he needed me to be at any given moment. Elena's heart clenched. Damien. The nightmares started then. They've never stopped. He turned to face her, his expression raw with old pain. I know you think I'm a monster, Elena. Most days I think you're right. You're not a monster. I destroyed your career because you wounded my ego. I blacklisted you from every publication in the city to punish you for rejecting me. How is that not monstrous? The confession hung between them like a live wire. Elena stared at him, processing the admission she'd suspected, but never had confirmed. You're right, she said quietly. That was monstrous. Something in his face crumpled. I know, but it's not who you are now. How can you possibly know that? Elena moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes, because the monster wouldn't have paid for Marco's surgery without being asked. Have made sure he had the best doctors, the best care, everything he needed to not just survive but thrive. That was part of our deal. The deal was for his medical bills. You've done so much more than that. She thought of the private room, the specialized equipment, the team of surgeons who'd normally have a 6-month waiting list. You've given him a real chance at life. Damien looked away, but not quickly enough to hide the moisture in his eyes. He reminds me of myself at that age. Smart, curious, completely dependent on someone else's choices for his survival. Is that why you really agreed to this marriage? Not for the inheritance, but because you understood what it felt like to be powerless? Maybe his voice was barely audible. Does it matter? Elena reached out without thinking, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He leaned into the touch like a man dying of thirst finally offered water. It matters to me. They stood there, in the silence of the penthouse, 40 stories above a city that never slept. And Elena felt something fundamental shift between them. The man she'd married out of desperation wasn't the villain she'd constructed in her mind. He was something more complicated, more human, more worthy of forgiveness than she'd ever imagined. Elena, his voice was rough with emotion. I know. This changes everything. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. 'Cause he was right. Understanding Damien, seeing past his defenses to the wounded boy beneath, changed absolutely everything. The question was whether she was brave enough to let it. Outside, the city glittered like scattered diamonds, beautiful and unforgiving. Inside, two people who'd started as enemies stood on the precipice of something that felt dangerously like love. Elena dropped her hand, stepping back before she could do something irreversible. We should get some sleep. Damien nodded, though. His eyes never left her face. Elena? Yeah, thank you. For listening. She smiled, surprising herself with how genuine it felt. Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me. As Elena walked back to her bedroom, she could feel the weight of her decision settling around her shoulders. She'd entered this marriage as a transaction, a desperate woman selling her integrity to save her brother's life. Now she was in danger of something much more complicated. Something that felt suspiciously like falling in love with a man who'd just confessed to destroying her career out of wounded pride. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent weeks hating Damien Sterling, only to discover that the person she really needed to forgive was herself, for being naive enough to believe that love could bloom in the soil of mutual desperation, for hoping that maybe, just maybe, this fake marriage might become something real. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and hope, a combination Elena had grown to associate with miracles and small packages. Marco sat propped up against pillows that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his color better than it had been in months. The doctors say I might be able to go back to school next semester, he said, his eyes bright with possibility. Real school, not just home tutoring. Lena squeezed his hand, marveling at how warm it felt. For so long, his fingers had been cold, his circulation poor from a heart that couldn't keep up with his body's demands. Now he looked like a normal 12-year-old boy, excited about algebra and lunch period politics. That's amazing, Marco. It's because of him, isn't it? Marco's voice carried a knowing tone that reminded Elena he was wise beyond his years. Your husband. He made sure I got the good doctors. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. Damien had done more than ensure good doctors. He'd personally consulted with specialists in 3 countries, arranged for experimental treatments that weren't even available in most hospitals, and somehow made sure Marco never felt like a charity case in the process. When do I get to meet him? The question she'd been dreading for weeks. Elena had kept her 2 worlds carefully separate. Visiting Marco during the day while Damien was at work, maintaining the fiction that their marriage was too new, too precious to share. Soon, she lied. He's been traveling a lot for work. Marco's expression suggested he wasn't buying it, but he let the topic drop. At 12, he'd already learned more about adult complications than any child should have to know. Elena was still thinking about his questions when she returned to the penthouse that evening. Damien was in his study, surrounded by contracts and financial reports that painted the Sterling Industries boardroom in stark black and white. How's Marco? He asked without looking up. Good, really good. His cardiologist says the experimental treatment is working better than they hoped. Elena lingered in the doorway, studying the man who'd made her brother's recovery possible. He wants to meet you. Damien's pen stilled against the paper. That's not a good idea. Why not? Because in 3 weeks, this marriage ends and I disappear from your lives forever. There's no point in Marco getting attached. It's a casual way. He dismissed their connection, hit Elena like cold water. She'd spent the last week watching Damien's defenses crumble, believing they were building something real together. Apparently, she'd been more naive than she'd realized. Write the contract. She turned to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, I think you'd like each other, Elena. Something in his voice made her pause. When she looked back, Damien was watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Never mind. Midnight. She was halfway down the hall. She heard his study door close with unusual force. The next morning brought catastrophe in the form of Richard Sterling in a manila envelope thick with photographs. Elena was alone in the penthouse when he arrived, Damien having left earlier for a board meeting. She almost didn't answer the door, but Richard's voice carried clearly through the expensive wood. I know you're in there, Elena. We need to talk. She opened the door to find Richard impeccably dressed and wearing a smile that belonged on a shark. Mrs. Sterling, how lovely to see you again. Damien isn't here? Perfect. It's you I wanted to speak with anyway. He pushed past her into the living room, making himself comfortable on the Italian leather sofa. Coffee? This might take a while. Do you want, Richard? He opened the manila envelope with theatrical precision, spreading photographs across the glass coffee. Table like tarot cards, revealing an ugly future. Elena's blood turned to ice. Ow. The photos showed her outside St. Mary's Hospital, taken from multiple angles over several weeks. Her entering the building in scrubs, leaving with tears on her face, embracing Marco in his hospital bed. Touching, really, Richard said conversationally. Such devotion to a sick brother. Medical bills must have been astronomical. Those are private moments, not anymore. He selected one photograph showing Elena crying in the hospital parking garage, the same night Damien had proposed there. Arrangement, this one's my favorite. You can actually see the desperation. Very moving. Elena forced herself to remain calm. What's your point? My point is that I know exactly why you married my cousin. Not for love, not for his charming personality, but for cold, hard cash to pay for little Marco's treatment. Richard leaned back, supremely confident. A marriage of convenience, you might call it. The kind that would invalidate grandfather's inheritance clause if certain board members were to see evidence of fraud. Elena's hands clenched into fists. Do you want? Simple. Divorce papers filed by the end of the week, citing irreconcilable differences. You disappear quietly, keep the money for Marco's treatment as a consolation prize, and everyone wins. Everyone except Damien. Damien will survive. He's remarkably resilient. Richard's smile turned predatory. Unlike your brother, who I understand, has a very expensive ongoing treatment protocol. It would be a shame if his medical team suddenly found themselves unavailable. The threat landed like a physical blow. Elena stared at the man who could destroy everything she'd sacrificed for with a few phone calls to the right people. You're threatening a child. I'm offering you a choice. Walk away now, or watch this whole house of cards collapse and take Marco's treatment with it. Richard stood, straightening his tie with practiced ease. You have 48 hours to decide. He left the photographs scattered across the coffee table like evidence at a crime scene. Lena sank onto the couch, staring at images of her own. Desperation reflected back at her in glossy color. She was still sitting there when Damien came home 2 hours later. Elena. He stopped short when he saw the photographs, his face going pale. What is this? Richard's insurance policy? She handed him the worst of the photos, the one showing her signing the marriage contract with tears streaming down her face. He knows everything. Damien studied the image with the focused intensity he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. When was this taken? The night we made our deal. He's been watching us from the beginning. Kina laughed bitterly. We never had a chance. What? Does he want my voluntary exit from this marriage? Divorce papers filed by Friday, or he goes to the board with proof that our marriage is fraudulent. Damien set the photograph down with careful precision. And if you refuse, he threatens Marco's treatment. Apparently, Richard has connections at the hospital. A silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Elena watched Damien process the information, his lawyer's mind probably already calculating angles and contingencies. We could fight this, he said finally. With what? He has photographic evidence, medical records, a paper trail showing exactly when Marco's treatment began and when we got married. Any investigation would prove he's right. So what are you saying? Elena met his eyes, seeing her own heartbreak reflected there. I'm saying Richard wins. I file for divorce, you lose your inheritance, and we both pretend the last 6 weeks never happened. No. The single word hung in the air like a challenge to fate itself. Damien, be realistic. I am being realistic. He moved closer, his gray eyes blazing with something that looked suspiciously like determination. Richard wants you gone because he knows what I've been too stubborn to admit, which is that somewhere between hating you for your principles and admiring you for your strength, I fell in love with my fake wife. Elena's breath caught. Don't. What? Don't tell you that watching you fight for Marco's life made me remember what it feels like to care about something more than money. Don't admit that your laugh has become my favorite sound in the world. Don't confess that the thought of losing you hurts worse than losing every dollar my grandfather left me. This was supposed to be temporary. Plans change. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle, despite the desperation in his voice. I love you, Elena, not because you saved me from Richard's schemes, or because you agreed to this insane arrangement. I love you because you're brave enough to sacrifice everything for the people you care about, principled enough to hate me for the right reasons, and stubborn enough to make me want to be worthy of you. Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks. I can't let you lose everything because of me. I already lost everything the day I blacklisted you from every publication in the city. Everything that mattered anyway. His thumbs traced the tears from her cheeks. Let me earn it back. Let me prove that love isn't just another contract to be negotiated. In Marco's treatment, I'll make sure he gets everything he needs, married or divorced. That was never conditional on our arrangement, no matter what the paperwork says. Lena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. Stay and fight for a love that had grown from the ashes of mutual desperation, knowing they might both lose everything. Or walk away to protect the people she cared about most, even if it meant breaking her own heart in the process. If we do this, if we fight Richard together, there's no guarantee we'll win. There never is. Damien's smile was soft and utterly sincere. But I'd rather lose everything with you than win it all alone. Elena thought of Marco's bright eyes when he talked about going back to school, of the way Damien's nightmares had quieted since they'd started sharing their real selves with each other, of the life they could build together if they were brave enough to reach for it. Okay, she whispered. Okay, let's fight him, together. Damien's kiss tasted like victory, and promises like morning coffee and second chances. When they broke apart, Elena could see their reflection in the penthouse windows. Two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances. "I love you too," she said against his lips, in case that wasn't clear. It's clear now. Battle with Richard would be ugly, complicated, and possibly futile. But as Elena melted into Damien's arms, she realized that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were stacked against you. Especially then. 6 months later, Elena Sterling sat in the front row of Marco's middle school graduation, watching her brother accept an award for academic excellence with the biggest smile she'd ever seen. Beside her, Damien squeezed her hand and whispered congratulations that were meant for both of them. Richard had ultimately failed in his attempts to destroy their marriage, though not for lack of trying. The board investigation had been thorough and brutal, but in the end, love had proven more convincing than photographs. Damien had kept his inheritance. Richard had been quietly removed from any position of influence, and Elena had discovered that being Mrs. Sterling suited her far better than she'd ever imagined. "Proud of you," she told Marco, as he bounded over after the ceremony, his cap askew and his grin infectious. "Proud of you too," he replied, then turned to Damien. "Both of you. Thanks for fighting for us." Damien's arm tightened around Elena's waist. "Thank you for being worth fighting for." As they walked out of the school into the warm afternoon sunshine, Elena reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. She'd entered a marriage of convenience to save her brothers. Life had somehow found a love worth building a lifetime around. It hadn't been the fairy tale she'd read about as a child, but it was something better. It was real, complicated, hard-won, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. Behind them, Marco chattered excitedly about high school plans and summer adventures, his voice strong and clear in the way that only came from a heart that beat steadily and true. Ahead of them lay whatever came next, together, the end.